Now in this video, we're going to be comparing a dipole antenna with a monopole antenna. Now on your left, we have a dipole antenna and it has two horizontal metal poles. These metal poles does not have any electrical connection with each other. Now they are connected with a coaxial cable back to the transmitter. Now the inner part of the coaxial cable, the inner conductor of the coaxial cable is connected to one side of the antenna, and the outer conductor of the coaxial cable is connected to the other side of the antenna. Now this is also interchangeable. We can have the inner side of the coaxial cable connected here and the outer side connected there as well. They are interchangeable. Now this supporting structure here doesn't have any electrical characteristics whatsoever. It is just here to support the antenna. Dipole antennas are commonly used for AM radio, FM radio, and two-way UHF and VHF radio communication. It is also used for cellular base stations, plus many other services. Now the monopole antenna also has a cable going from the transmitter to a vertical pole. Now the dipole antenna has two horizontal poles. The monopole antenna has one vertical pole. Now the inner conductor of the coaxial cable is connected to the monopole antenna, and the outer conductor is connected to the ground plane. Now you cannot reverse this. This is the way it is always. You cannot reverse this and connect this to the ground plane. No, this inner conductor is always connected to the monopole antenna, and the outer part is always connected to the ground plane. Now this ground plane could be a metal surface where the monopole antenna is mounted. So you will connect the outer conductor directly to the metal surface. Or you could remove the metal surface completely and mount the antenna directly to the earth. And the ground plane would become the earth. So this outer conductor would be connected directly to the earth. Like you'll put a stake into the earth and then connect the outer conductor to it. Okay? Monopole antennas are commonly used for AM and FM radio, mobile phones, Wi-Fi routers, and VHF radio on ships or boats. Every transmitter has impedance. This transmitter has 50 ohm impedance, and so does this transmitter here. So in order to get our signal from the transmitter to the antenna, for both the dipole and the monopole antenna, we need to use a cable that also have a 50 ohm impedance. We know that an RG8 coaxial cable has an impedance of 50 ohms. So we're going to use an RG8 coaxial cable to get our signal from the transmitter to the antenna for both the dipole and the monopole antenna. Now the dipole antenna and the monopole antenna also got to be 50 ohms in order to have maximum power transferred. That is, in order to get this 250 watts of power from the transmitter to the antenna, the transmitter, the coaxial cable, and the antenna all got to be 50 ohms. The question is, what will happen if we have 50 ohms on our transmitter, 50 ohms on the cable, but the antenna for either the dipole antenna or the monopole antenna is not 50 ohms. Let's say the antenna is only 40 ohms, either the monopole or the dipole antenna. What will happen? Well, what happens is that in order to have maximum power transfer, that is, this 250 watts all radiated out into the air for receivers out there to pick it up. The more power you have, the further your signal will go. So you want to have all 250 watts being radiated out into the air. If your antenna here is not 50 ohms, you're not going to have all of your power being transferred into the air. Part of that power is going to be reflected. Anything that isn't transferred out is going to be reflected back down the cable. Let's say, for instance, we have 40 ohms instead of 50 ohms, and let's say 90% of our power is being radiated out, but 10% is being radiated back towards the transmitter. We have something here called a standing wave being created as a result of that. What is a standing wave? Well, just think about this. If you have current coming from the transmitter okay, and you have current being reflected back, the two currents are going to meet somewhere along the cable. Just replace the current with water, okay, and you have water coming from this way and water coming from this way. When they meet, you're going to have a wave being created. This is the same idea. This is an electrical wave instead of a water wave, but it's the same idea. If it is only 10% of the power being reflected, this may not be a big deal. However, the more reflection you have, the worse it gets. If the power being reflected is much greater, what happens is that you'll have a larger wave, and this larger wave could damage the coaxial cable because of overheating in the area that the wave has been created. And also, it could damage the transmitter. So this is why you don't want to have reflective power. You want to radiate all of your power across the antenna out into the air for both the dipole and the monopole antenna. So far we have talked about the fact that our transmitter have an impedance of 50 ohms, and so does our coaxial cable for both the dipole and monopole antenna. Now we want to calculate the impedance of the dipole antenna and the monopole antenna. That's the only thing that's missing. What we do know as well is that this transmitter here is sending 100 megahertz for both the dipole and the monopole antenna. The first thing we need to do to figure out the impedance of both antennas is to figure out what the wavelength is going to be at 100 megahertz for both the dipole and the monopole antenna. Okay, it's the same frequency, so it should be the same wavelength. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to come back to this to figure out what the impedance will be on both of these antennas. In order to find the wavelength at 100 megahertz, we have to do a little bit of math. I know a lot of you do not like math, but I promise you this is going to be quite simple, and it will be very rewarding to be able to find the solution to this problem, and it is quite simple. So stick with me for a few more minutes and I'll just show you how easy this is. Okay, now wavelength is equal to speed of light over frequency. The speed of light is 300 million meters per second. The frequency, as we talked about earlier, is 100 megahertz. Okay, so how we do this is that we move the decimal point from the end here right over just before the 3, and by doing that we have 3 times 10 to the 8. We have the decimal point right here. We move the decimal point 8 places. That's how come we got 10 to the 8. Okay, it's that simple. So just stay with me now. Underneath here we got 100 megahertz. A megahertz is a million, okay, and a million is 6 zeros. Okay, so this is 100 and 6 zeros. So we have 100 times 10 to the 6. This 6 represents the zeros after 100. Okay, that's simple. Got that so far? Okay, now what we do at this point is that we divide 3 by 100. Okay, dividing 3 by 100, we will get 0.03. And here the 10 to the 8 and then 10 to the 6, we subtract 8 minus 6. Okay, and you will have 10 to the 2. That's simple. Okay, simple so far, nothing complicated. Okay, so now all we do is move this decimal point over 2 places, because we have 10 to the 2, that is 2 digits, so we move it over 2 digits to this side. Okay, so now we have 3, and it's 3 meters. Wavelength is always in meters. For the wavelength, this wavelength here at a frequency of 100 megahertz is 3 meters. So now we'll go back and I'll show you how to get the impedance for both antennas. From our calculations, we figured out that when a frequency of 100 megahertz is sent to the antenna, a wavelength of 3 meters will be sent from the dipole antenna and also from the monopole antenna. Now, dipole antennas have half wavelength. That simply means that the length of the antenna is half of whatever the wavelength is. So if the wavelength is 3 meters, then what I did here is to divide 3 meters by 2. I got 1.5 meters. So this is 1.5 meters from this antenna right over to this antenna. Both antennas together for a total of 1.5 meters. Now for the monopole antenna, it is a quarter wavelength. It would be a quarter of the wavelength. In this case, it is 3 meters. So what I did is to divide 3 meters by 4, and I got 0.75 meters. So the length of this antenna here would be 0.75 meters. Now the ground plane would also be at least 0.75 meters if it is a metallic ground plane. Okay, if it is out of metal, it would be 0.75 meters. Now if we're using the earth as a ground plane, now you don't have to worry about that. But if it is a metallic surface, it has to be at least 0.75 meters in diameter. It could be larger than 0.75 meters, but not smaller than 0.75 meters. So now we have done all of our calculations. We know the size of both the dipole antenna and the monopole antenna. We know that dipole antenna is 1.50 meters in length and the monopole antenna is 0.75 meters. These calculations we have done is based on the antenna being a half a wavelength above ground. So from here down to this red line here basically would be a half a wavelength. Now a half a wavelength gives you an impedance of 73 ohms, not 50 ohms that we need. And over here 0.75 meters is the height of this antenna, gives you an impedance of 36.5 ohms. But we need 50 ohms for both the dipole and monopole. So what do we do? Well, when you lower the antenna, you actually reduce the impedance. So in order to get the impedance lower, we have to lower this antenna. And this one over here, since it's 36.5 ohms, we would have to raise this antenna. We will have to make this monopole antenna taller. But how do we really know how high to go in order to get that 50 ohms? We don't. So what we do is to use an instrument called an antenna analyzer in order to see exactly where we have reached the 50 ohms, where the antenna's impedance would be 50 ohms for both the dipole antenna and the monopole. This is an antenna analyzer. It is used to measure reflective power. When there is no reflective power, we can be sure that we have impedance matching. Now the antenna analyzer will be placed between the transmitter and the antenna. You will have a short RGA cable placed between the transmitter and the antenna analyzer, and the other RGA cable from antenna analyzer to the antenna. With the transmitter send the signal out, if we don't have impedance matching with the antenna, you're going to have part of that signal being reflected back. The antenna analyzer would measure how much of that signal is coming back. This is how you could tell if you have an impedance matching antenna, because when there's impedance matching, you don't have any signal being reflected back, and you will see 1-1 on the screen of the antenna analyzer. 1-1 means there's no signal being reflected, and this is what you're looking for. With no signal being reflected, this antenna here will be 50 ohms. So you will have maximum power being transferred because your transmitter, your cable, and your antenna would all be 50 ohms. When I had made a chart for you with all the different standing wave ratios. So I have this SWR, which stands for standing wave ratio. This is just reflective power. Standing wave ratio is just a formal name for it. It's the same reflective power we talked about. Whereas you have your power coming from your transmitter, and if you don't have impedance matching, you have power being reflected back. This power is going to meet somewhere along your cable, and when this power meets, you're going to have a wave. This is where the name standing wave comes from. You're going to have a wave inside the cable, and the more reflection you have, the higher that wave is going to be. So if you have one to one, you have zero power being reflected back, which is good. This is what you want, right? Zero power. So here you have impedance matching. The impedance of your antenna, your cable, and your transmitter are all matching. They have the same impedance. In this case, we were using 50 ohms, right? 1.5 to 1, you're having about 4% being reflected back. 2 to 1, 11%. 3 to 1, 25%. 4 to 1, 36%. 5 to 1, 44%. And 10 to 1, 67%. When you reach 25%, you should start looking at doing adjustments like lowering or raising your antenna depending on, if it is too low or too high, right? Because if this problem becomes severe, you could, damage the cable become overheated, you could damage that cable, or you could actually damage your transmitter, which is actually worse than just damaging the cable, right? So it's important that you have impedance matching, or keep it as close as you possibly can to being matched. Now, I look at these numbers, and I just couldn't look at these numbers and figure out exactly what the percentage will be, because they don't really make a lot of sense by just looking at them and being able to figure out 4 to 1 means 36%. So I went ahead and got a calculation for you. This is how to calculate reflective percentage. I'm going to use 3 to 1, which is this one here, as our example. In this equation here, I have reflective signal 3 minus 1. That is this 3 here minus 1. And underneath here, I have 3 plus 1. Well, 3 minus 1 gives you 2, and 3 plus 1 gives you 4. So now I have a fraction of 2 over 4. Well, 2 divided by 4 is 0.5. So percentage reflection, I have 0.5 squared. So I squared this 0.5 times 100%. And 0.5 squared is equal to 0.25. So I multiply it by this same 100% and I get 25%. That is simply how this is done in order to get this 25% here. And you can do the same thing for any one of these and you'll get the correct answer. So you can keep this chart, or you can, keep this equation to work this out for yourself anytime, okay? I really hope this video was helpful to you. And if this video was helpful to you, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll be releasing some more videos like this one very soon. So if you subscribe, you'll get to see those videos as they are released. My name is Trevor from Telecom Training. Thank you for watching.